Well, hello everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today at this slightly strange, but I think we're all getting very used, aren't we, to these types of conferences and panel sessions, and delighted to be here at the Future of Publishing conference and to discuss our topic. Our panel today, we'll be discussing covering COVID, the story of a generation. And I'm delighted to welcome here to join me Alison Phillips, editor of the Daily Mirror, and James Mitchinson, editor. Hi, Alison. And James Mitchinson, editor of the Yorkshire Post. Winner last week of Regional Newspaper of the Year. Congratulations, mate. Congratulations. And we're obviously going to be discussing a number of issues regarding the media and from an editorial point of view, how we're covering recent events that's going on. So I thought I'd just kick off by asking both of you, if this is being described as the story of a generation, would you agree that that's the case? And if so, why? Alison, what about for yourself?
It certainly feels that way, that this is the story of our generation. I mean, as so many people were saying when all this began, this sort of feels like our generation's war. And the thing that's really sort of pushed us to the edge and has really sort of made us think about what it means to do our job and also what kind of world we're living in. I mean, you never know with news, though. You never know quite what could be around the corner next. But I mean, certainly it's going to have a huge impact, not just, well, it's had a huge impact on this year, but the ramifications of it will last for many more years to come.
And James?
For the local brands, the regional brands, I think it's not just one story. It's thousands and thousands of stories, and because there's regional titles and local titles, we operate very much at the familial level, and we have very close links with the families in and around Yorkshire. My journalists have been spending, sadly, many hours talking to people who are in grief and who are distraught by losing loved ones. And that takes its toll in itself on my team and my journalists. But there's also been that flip side where there have been so many tales of heroism and selflessness and sacrifice. So it's kind of made the newsroom a little bit sort of schizophrenic, because there's all of this grief and pain to process. And because family funerals couldn't be held in the same way, so with limited or no mourners, we've found increasingly that the local papers have become part of the process of closure. So we've begun, or at least we did previously, writing obituaries, for example, for free, rather than charging people as part of the classifieds package. So that's been a huge privilege to play our part in the sort of the closure when people are losing loved ones through COVID. But it's also felt like a huge responsibility too. And of course, the way we've had to tell those stories through technology like this, at a moment where you want to have the most intimate conversations with people, you have this difficult sort of veneer of technology between you. So I've nothing but admiration for the way my guys have stepped up to this challenge. But a story of many generations, I think, would be my answer, because the pandemic has very much attacked families. It's attacked the older generation, hasn't it? We've seen clinical evidence to suggest that older people are more adversely affected, and so the whole family has had to come together to figure out how they tackle this. So yeah, unique in every way.
It's interesting you said that about the generational thing, because my father, who's 90, and my dear mum, who's 88, I asked them about this. Have you seen? And they said, crisis, what crisis was the answer? You know, when they were children, they said Hitler was dropping bombs on us, and there was a massive German army 22 miles across the channel, and yet our parents remained remarkably calm about the whole thing. I bet they weren't that calm, my grandparents, but it's interesting. So James, you've spoken beforehand about the relationship between yourselves and your readers, and have you noticed then that has changed going through this crisis?
Good question. I don't think it's changed. What I think's happened is that feelings that were already there and perhaps taken for granted have deepened and become more acute and visible. I think what this pandemic has shown us, and shown our readers is quite how much they do appreciate having a trusted newspaper, one that has been handed down the generations in their family that they know they can turn to. I don't know, you might think me a hopeless optimist, but I think despite the circumstances, I think we have become closer to the audience. I think we have the relationships become more intimate, if I dare say. The engagement levels have been much higher, and the conversations have been more in volume, more letters, more posts on threads, more involvement by the readers on our stories than ever before. So I certainly think the relationship has, we've come to realise how much we need each other. I'll say that.
I completely agree with James. I think the Mirror's always had a strong relationship with its readers. There's always been a closeness there, and we work very hard to ensure that we remain close to those readers. But the last couple of months, that there's almost like a sort of a greater intensity to it, and part of that is the importance around the actual hard news element of what we're doing and holding the government to account over some of the policies, and in giving everybody the advice they need to keep them and their families safe. And then the idea that this is all coming to, it's all being told to them by people that they've trusted over years and years. We've got Paul Routledge, we've got Miriam Stoppard, we've got Brian Reed, we've got these names that are part of people's lives. So there's that element. But then there's also this other element of being I've always thought the people that read the Mirror, that it's almost like they're part of a club which just so happens to put out a daily newspaper every day. And I think there's a real sense of that. And people have been sending in pictures of what they've done to their garden during lockdown. They've been sending in pictures of their family that they're really missing, and they were telling us what they wanted to do when they were reunited. And that real sense that we were a constant, we were part of that community that was still there. And I think in terms of the print sales, really, I mean, when this all started and we were put into lockdown, I was absolutely terrified. I thought, the shops were going to be closed. I thought we could be down to 50% locked off our print sale overnight. I was terrified. And then, we woke up a couple of days later, and at its worst, it fell to sort of about 20% off. And that was bad enough. But remember, a lot of our readers are that bit older, so going out was a real, people were literally taking their life in their hands to go to the shop to buy a Mirror. And we're now, getting pretty close back to where we were pre-corona. So, and I completely agree with James. There's been a greater intensity to that relationship through all this.
Well, one thing, if I may, that I think has changed for me is me. We had a moment where the front page picture of the day was two NHS workers in NHS scrubs, and it was taken from a distance by an agency. So I didn't know who the ladies were, but they were clearly distraught, and they were clearly knackered, for want of a better word. And so I took to Twitter to ask Twitter if they could help me track these two people down, because essentially I wanted to write them a letter and send them some flowers and just say, we see your sacrifice, we see what you're giving up to keep us safe. And I wrote them a little letter, and when they received it, they wrote back to me to say that they were in floods of tears and that they didn't realise that people could see what they were giving, and then they told me how much it meant to them. I wouldn't have done that as an editor before this pandemic, and I think if anything's changed, it's me in the way I sort of see our readers and the relationship that we have with them.
Do you think this was happening anyway? Because I don't want to do a disservice to everything that's gone on, and it has been a shock to the system, to society, and without a doubt, we are all valuing things that we always did value, but perhaps haven't stopped in our busy hurly-burly lives to actually say, I miss that, I appreciate that, and all of that. But the latest PAMCO numbers showed a surge in new readers over the last year. Something like that's over the last year before the pandemic hit. Something like 7.4 million extra daily readers. I'm just reading across the industry, which means total daily membership is now 40 million a day. I mean, there's staggering numbers. From both your perspectives, national and regional, do you think that despite the fact of you hear the mainstream media being knocked by people who shouldn't, there is in fact a great deal of underlying trust for what we do? Alison?
Yes, I think obviously we went through a period where I think our own confidence as an industry was knocked. I think we saw the advance of Facebook and Google, and we just saw these enormous great things ploughing ahead, and we were getting washed along in the wake. And I think the general public thought, oh, I can get my news there, it's free, it's cheap, it's here, it's there, or some members of the general public did. And then I think we came through that, both as an industry, where we started saying, hang on a minute, who's breaking the stories? Who's making the news? Who's holding those in power to account? Who's speaking on behalf of those people in this country that otherwise do not have a voice? So I think we regained our confidence. And at the same time, I think the readers have come, and the general public more broadly, have come to understand the importance of quality news. And I think, you can take that analogy that, do you want to go out and eat, burgers and rubbish food every night for the rest of your life, which is essentially what you're consuming if you take your news feeds from social media? Or do you actually want to have something that's got some value and is good for you and is good for your family? And I think we're getting to that place. I feel very strongly still that the social media companies are still taking too much of our money, too much advertising revenue, without playing their part in the importance of the ecosystem of the media. But I hope that there is a national will to move against that now, because it's just not good enough. It's not good enough for us as a nation. It's not good enough for our children. There was that amazing bit of research that came out the other day, I don't know if you saw that, which said that people who predominantly get their news from social media were more likely to break lockdown. They were more likely to think that coronavirus was built in a lab, and they're more likely to think it's to do with 5G. Now, so that means that you can't even call it news. That stuff that's swilling around the social media ecosystem is actually potentially costing lives. And so at some point, as a society, and I hope that moment is now, we have to put value in facts and truth and people that are giving you that fact and that truth.
James, similar thoughts?
Yeah, Alison's in danger of energising me to a degree where I wouldn't be able to stop on this subject. We had a very good election at the Yorkshire Post by sticking to our principles of high quality, trusted journalism, fact checking everything that was said, and being meticulous about the journalism that we published in terms of rooting out myths, debunking lies, etc. And we sort of, from that moment, if you like, that's carried through. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about this space, in terms of what Alison talks about, the McDonaldization of journalism, where we all become really efficient, we can produce content very quickly, but what happens is the end result is an homogenized product that isn't for the betterment or the nourishment necessarily of the community it serves. And I've long been a believer, and I hope that this is something that other people share a sort of belief in, that there is an opportunity now for a conscientious advertisers consortium to come together with an accredited, responsible publishers network that really changes the game here. Yes, the tech platforms could take more responsibility for the content that appears on their platforms. Yes, they could absolutely give us a fairer share of the revenue that is generated on the back of content our journalists produce. But I do think the opportunity to change the internet and change society for the better sits with the advertisers, because what chief executive doesn't want to feel like their money, their marketing spend, is actually going towards public interest journalism that is created for the betterment of the people and the place it serves, rather than content that is created to win prizes from an indiscriminate digital paymaster, and one that can give just as much revenue, if not more revenue, because of blocked AdWords, for content that comes from offshore content farms that have quite sinister agendas behind them. Let's face it, we've all seen them. And yet our journalism can sometimes receive less programmatic revenue. And this is not known to the chief executives of these companies. This is unwitting to them. But the money they spend is being sucked into these dark corners of the internet without necessarily their knowledge. But I do think there's an opportunity for a chief executive somewhere to put their hand up and say, enough's enough. I want to be one of the people who changes the internet. I want to be one of the people who is seen to invest in quality journalism that really does enrich people's lives. And I want to be one of the people who history records as being the ones that saw the downfall of hateful, disingenuous, evil content that, frankly, Alison's right, cost lives. Sorry.
No, don't apologise at all. I think we're all applauding. We're all applauding here in the background. I mean, if it's any light at the end of the tunnel, thinking that I'm old enough in the tooth to remember the previous big surge, shall we say, that was supposedly was going to sweep away local, regional newspapers anyway, if not nationals, and that was the arrival in the UK of free newspapers. Now, I know many of the audience you mean there was a time when there weren't free newspapers in the UK? They came and they almost destroyed, particularly weekly newspapers, but also some of the daily regionals out there, because suddenly every former advertising manager from a newspaper left and launched their own, but the content of it was all being written by the manager's wife or son or something like that, and just fill it with nice things, and of course advertisers found that they didn't get a reaction, they didn't get a response if they advertised in those free sheets. Only papers that actually had quality journalism were actually being read, and I think we're seeing that. That's a very simplified form back to on with the internet as well. It's this now realization that's coming around that actually, what can I believe in? But is it true? Well, can I believe what's been put in the Mirror? Can I believe what's been put in the Post? And now you've got me on one. I must come off on that.
But it does cost. It costs money, doesn't it? It costs a lot of money. I mean, so we did the Dominic Cummings breaking lockdown story in conjunction with the Guardian back in sort of the height when lockdown was still at its height. And we had people working on that. We had 3 or 4 reporters working on that for 3 or 4 weeks. So that is a lot of your resource on one story, and for every one of those stories where, yes, you get a result and that story works, there are countless other stories where you just don't get enough to get it past the lawyers, or it falls down in one way or another. And there is a cost to all of that, and it's an unseen cost. But I think that if we starve, and if advertisers don't play their part in the ecosystem of a healthy media, then those stories will disappear. And I really worry about what that means for us as a country. And I know I probably sound a little bit hysterical, but you look at the countries where there have been worse death rates. A lot of those are the countries where there isn't a free press, and you haven't got that journalism which is out there reporting those stories that need to be told.
Absolutely, I can't agree with you more. And that brings me, you were saying there about the Dominic Cummings story and you being able to put staff on that. It brings me to my next point, is that how has all of this physically changed the way that you run your newsrooms and your teams? Because I've been working in newspapers for more decades than I'd like to remember, and always loved the buzz of the newsroom. In fact, when newsrooms no longer had typewriters, yes, I am that old, because that's what you have to shout over the typewriters to everyone. And then the phones stopped ringing even because people emailed or texted and things like that. And newsrooms became very quiet. I would go around saying, for goodness sake, you guys, make some noise, talk about things, because it is that buzz, it is that kind of overhearing things. That's just not possible, one presumes, at the moment.
No, that is quite. I mean, the actual practicalities. I mean, I am astonished. I remain astonished that we've managed to carry on putting out the website and the print product every single day from home. I mean, if someone had said this to us at the start of the year, I'd have said that's completely impossible. There's no way to do it. So that's an interesting thing, isn't it? When you're thrown adversity, you innovate and you find ways around it. So that's been great. But there's no doubt that operating on Zoom or Google Hangouts or whatever has its limitations, in that you lose some of the creativity, you lose some of the chance conversations which open your mind to different things that you could be looking at. And there's the practicalities as well. Like on that Dominic Cummings story, I was here in my spare room, the night editor was at home in his flat, the head of news was sort of like trying to use the story from next to his boys' bunk beds. So and then it got very late, and then that moment when you've got that buzz, you think, yes, we've nailed this story, we've got it over the line, and there's no one to share it with. And I was sort of like going into my teenage son's bedroom saying, I think we've got it. Whereas ordinarily you'd have been in the office and then you'd all gone for a drink afterwards. So it's different, but it's not been like this forever. And I think perhaps it will have made us realise what the importance of contact. We're very social people, journalists. That's how you get stories, is by chatting to people. And we've managed, but I don't really think, well, I think some elements we'll be able to keep into the long term, but I think we should never forget the importance of being together.
Absolutely. And James, you said about the emotional toll it was taking on team members. And of course, we know in our profession it's like that. People say horrible things to you. People can be quite aggressive, and it's quite upsetting to cover some stories. But then, of course, whoever that journalist goes back to the office usually, and you can get that empathy and support that's there. Have you found that a problem though with your teams in this terrible situation, and not being able to put an arm around them?
It's certainly made us appreciate one another more. Yeah, without question. You learn so much from being in a diverse newsroom, don't you? We've got 21-year-old graduate trainees to the most senior people in the newsroom, and all of those people coming together, and the different strengths of the different desks. You know, we call our features desk the cerebral team for a reason. You know, they're much smarter than I am. They live and breathe the work they do. You know, a highly intelligent bunch who you really do enjoy just being around because of the type of people there. And then you've got the sports guys who are constantly taking the mick out of each other, you know, sometimes throwing things at one another. And you've got the news teams who are chasing really difficult, hard news stories. You know, the photographers, they've been since the 18th of March when I kicked everybody out of the building. You know, we've not seen each other face to face since then, but the photographers have been on the front line of the COVID crisis throughout. You know, they haven't stopped working. Some of them have got parking tickets from overzealous parking attendants. Some of them have been asked what their business is. You know, they've had quite a tough time of it on recording this moment in history. So it's made us definitely appreciate one another more. And I think when we get to see one another again, I think certainly it'll be a moment that people will treasure for sure.
I know it was interesting you mentioned about the sports team there, and absolutely, you know, the sports teams, they always bring you down to earth, don't they? And
They do.
I was heartened, shall we say, and I mean this, you'll understand why, when I read this week that the whole city have banned the whole Daily Mail from watching, because they wrote some articles that were critical of them. The amount of times that happened to me in my career, I just think, great. Normal life is going on.
Yeah.
I'm sorry Alison was the same, but our sports teams, this has been their finest hour.
Yes.
They've gone for over 100 days with no sport, and they've had to really dig deep within themselves, within the reserves of their knowledge and their passion for what they do. And some of the features, I'm saying to my sports editor, I don't think you're going to get to go to a live game again, because some of this stuff is so bloody brilliant. So it's been, you know, I'm so proud of all of my team in so many ways, but for those guys to have their bread and butter switched off and still produce, you know, the type of content, the top class feature content that they produce, they've absolutely blown me away.
Superb. And I mean, going back to levels, shall we say, of government again, and away from sport, although it probably is a sport, of course, always dealing with government at local as well as, of course, national level. I mean, before the COVID crisis struck, the Society of Editors, we were pretty vocal in our response to number 10. It seemed we started the year with problems there, particularly with the changes to the lobby correspondence scheme. We were seeking assurances that it wouldn't lead to some correspondence being cut out, and of course that's exactly what happened. And then we saw, of course, that number 10 weren't sending ministers onto the Today programme. All that disappeared to some extent as soon as the crisis came along. But how have you found dealing with on a national level government, but also on a local level, James? Have you found it easier to actually deal with the police as well as with your local authorities?
Well, let me take government first. So prior to the lockdown, we attended a meeting in Downing Street where we spoke to the communications team. Prior to that, we've received every Prime Minister for the last, well, for the period I've been there. I've seen David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson. Rishi Sunak called the Yorkshire Post on Budget Day. We were the first, one of the first, if not the first regional papers that the Chancellor called on Budget Day. So the lines of communication are open to government for us, that's for sure. I don't think we can complain too much about that. And that's despite the fact that the Yorkshire Post, me and my team could quite possibly, given our One North campaign and Power Up the North campaign, we've probably been the biggest pain in the backside of any regional title in the country for the government. Holding Chris Grayling's feet to the fire over the implosion of the railway in the north was something that we didn't relish doing, but something that commuters in the north wanted us to do, and we had a duty to do. So we are still speaking truth to power. We are still asking awkward questions. But in my experience, and only this weekend, the Chancellor was in Yorkshire and he gave us a lot of his time and answered a lot of tricky questions, from the loan charge scandal to levelling up the regions. So I've no real grumbles in terms of the Yorkshire Post in its role as critical friend to government. I don't know if Alison's experience is similar.
Well, I mean, I think so. You refer some of the points that you referred to there, Ian, were really crucial to the Mirror. So, everybody knows what the Mirror is and what the Mirror stands for. You know, we're a left of centre paper. We've been supporting Labour since the 1945 election. So it goes back a long way. But despite that, we've always sort of managed to retain a fairly functioning relationship with whoever is in power. But things sort of started to go slightly wrong at the end of last year. So during the election, as you might recall, the Mirror was booted off the Conservative campaign bus, which had never happened before. And so at that point, there was two options for us. One, we could make a big fuss and say, look what the Tories have done to us and all this business. Or we could try, which is what I wanted to do, to actually find some kind of constructive way through, because that's not good for anybody. It's not good. It's not good for democracy generally. And also, I would never want that somebody in the future, supposing you have a Labour kicking, I don't know, the Telegraph or the Daily Mail off one of their buses. Because then that's when it all splinters and it all breaks down, and that's no good for the readers. It's no good for democracy and society more generally. So things got a bit tense then. And then, obviously, as you referred to, there was the issue earlier in the year where they changed the lobby briefings, which meant that some people weren't going to be getting access to information. And that's where it becomes really dangerous. And I think we were all really mindful that we were working with a team at Number 10 who not only were wanting to disrupt everything, but they wanted to kind of other us, I suppose. It's like we've seen it in the States. We've seen it with Donald Trump. It kind of suits the agenda to find an enemy, to be able to point at these people as troublemakers or whatever. And that's quite a tricky one to react to, because if you react like really hugely at that point, then you're playing into their hands. So that's what you want to do. But then at the same point, you can't be pushed around, and I'll never be pushed around by a bully. So that's not going to happen either. So, you know, in the end, I think we kind of found a way through that. And actually, at the very beginning of the crisis, I thought the way that the government handled it was excellent. There was an openness there. I thought after all the things they'd said and done about the BBC, and then suddenly you were watching those press conferences and it was straight to Laura Koonsberg, it was straight to the BBC, and you kind of think, yes, now you see, when there's a crisis, this country needs the BBC and it needs its trusted news brands. It's just unfortunate we had to get to a pandemic for them to appreciate that. But as for how we are now, I've got some concerns that the way that some of the remote press conferences have been working, in that I think we've seen cases where people have been cut off, there's not the opportunity to come back with second questions. And there's absolutely no doubt that there are many things during this pandemic where we really do need the government to have been held to account, over PPE, over testing, over the return to schools. There's been a lot of things where really there are very, very valid questions to be asked. And it is our job to ask them, and it is the government's job to answer them. And we already probably have a Prime Minister that doesn't particularly like scrutiny in the House of Commons. We have got to have that scrutiny in the wider media. So yeah, it's a bit scratchy, should we put it that way?
And it's getting that balance right, I would suggest, between doing everything you've just said there, Alison, and yourself, James, but also not appearing to the public, but basically just constantly trying to score points and have those gotcha moments, gotcha, at a time when we're in a national emergency.
Yeah, I agree entirely. I really do not. Government ministers are government ministers, and they should be spoken to properly and constructively and politely. I don't like it when people purporting to be journalists take a more reckless approach to holding ministers to account, and they start to turn to insults, and they start to turn towards dehumanizing the ministers and belittling them. These are individuals who are in the midst of an unprecedented pandemic. Yes, of course we should ask difficult questions about PPE. Of course we should ask difficult questions about track and trace. Absolutely, the journalists, I do believe, should be back in the room and able to ask questions in a dynamic environment where follow-ups are impossible to avoid by clicking a button on a laptop. But I really do hate it when essentially people fall into the trap of just becoming an internet troll when it comes to speaking to and addressing government ministers. But you can hold people to account perfectly well, probably much more effectively actually, if you ask intelligent, insightful, polite questions rather than resorting to insults.
Yeah,
absolutely, and the public, I think, are aware of that and sees all of that.
They are, and we've got a really responsible position there. So when a Mirror reporter goes into one of those press conferences, they are representing the Mirror readers. They are there asking the question that those people at home want answered, and so that's their purpose of being there, not to make themselves famous on Twitter or to get attention. They are there representing the Mirror readers who are never going to get the opportunity themselves, and we take that really seriously. But then of course that's why I also get incredibly cross if I feel that our readers are being disrespected.
Yes. Now we're running out of time here, cutting close, and we couldn't not have this discussion on this panel without looking at the recent events that have taken place, first in the United States and then over here, starting with the tragic death of George Floyd, the subsequent Black Lives Matter protests there and in this country, debates over statues and all kinds of things. Can I ask, what do you think your news brands can do to better accelerate the change that society appears to be clamouring for? And what you are doing in your own newsrooms to encourage diversity or to bring about diversity? James?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to show some acknowledgement and appreciation for the movement, because what it's achieved in such a short period of time has been, quite frankly, astonishing, but quite right too. It really does make me sad when we see, for example, last night, sorry, I've got a little guest who's just joined me. I thought I was going to get through. Come and sit with me.
Let's say hello.
There you go, Tom. Say hello.
Hello.
Yeah, it's astonishing what the movement's achieved, but I really do think this is an opportunity for us to, as you say, accelerate the change, because the change needs to happen, and we've got an opportunity, a moment now where we can make a difference. There are simple things you can do as a newspaper editor that help. Some really low-hanging fruit and quick wins, like making sure the contributors, the faces that appear as authors in your newspaper, reflects the community it serves. I managed to do a lot of that 5 years ago when I joined the Yorkshire Post. But there are more structural changes that are required. We've got to work more closely with the training institutions, the NCTJ, the industry as a whole, from the grassroots upwards, needs to consider a structural, strategic approach to ensuring that our newsrooms properly reflect the communities they serve, and that's both race and gender. The challenge I had with recruiting a football writer around 18 months ago, I think, is well documented. I put an advert out for a Leeds United writer. I received 60 applications. All of those applications were from male candidates, including a 13-year-old schoolboy. And I remember sort of in exasperation just declaring, how come a 13-year-old boy has the confidence to apply for this job, but not one single female has had the confidence to apply for this job? So there is so much work to be done. It does require a joined up approach from all of the trade bodies, all of the publishers and editors, frankly, people like me and people like Alison. We have an opportunity to make a difference, and we must not let it slip through our fingers.
Alison?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with James. I mean, this movement has been incredible. If you think in a few short weeks, I think there can be few people on who haven't looked at themselves and thought, okay, what part am I playing in those structures which are allowing racism to continue? And I think the industry has got a big problem, and it's got a lot of work it needs to do around this. I think, as James said, when I got this job 2 years ago, I did a bit of work about ensuring that we have writers and columnists and contributors who are black or from other ethnic minorities. So we've done a lot of work there. But if I look to myself and I say, who is in the room when we're making those really big decisions about what we're putting on page one, what the flow of the paper is, those sort of handful of crucial people right in the decision-making process, we have not got enough diversity in that group of people. And that is a real priority for me. And I'm sorry that it's taken for the events the last few weeks to make me accelerate that process. I knew it was a problem. I knew I had to do something about it, but I didn't do it quickly enough. But this has kind of galvanized me into putting into place a few things that are going to happen, which will hopefully improve that. And also looking at our recruitment, and also looking at about how we can bring people in, but how can then we accelerate their promotion so they're in we need people who are in the decision-making end of the business, because we've got a dual responsibility. We've got a responsibility as bosses to ensure that we have a workforce which is diverse and with diverse opinions and life experiences, but we've also got a responsibility to create products, to create newspapers and websites that are representative of the British public, and that actually help trying to solve this problem. Because I believe that thing, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, and we don't want to be part of the problem.
Yeah, thank you very much, both. We are unfortunately almost out of time. So it's been quite heavy so far, quite understandably so, but very optimistic. I thought well done. And so therefore, can I end on very quickly asking you both, just literally one sentence, what are you looking forward to doing the most first, once you're out of lockdown, and do anything that was once normal? James, yourself.
Well, I'm looking forward to taking this one around the block shortly. I'm trying to burn off some energy. From a professional perspective, I really hope that this does make, as I say, a chief executive pick up the phone and ask the question, what can I do to help make the internet a better, safer, more wholesome place for content to exist and for people to spend time? Privately, personally, it sounds cliched, but it really does matter. This one's not seen his grandparents for 3-4 months, and they miss him terribly. So a pub lunch with grandparents would be top of the list of priorities.
Oh, pub lunch. And Alison, yourself.
I completely agree with James. I think if we come out of this as a society that's got a greater value, puts a greater value on truth and trust and then I think that would be a fantastic thing, and we moved away from the nonsense that's swirling on social media. And I think that anything we can do now, I think, to build on the relationship with our readers, we're launching a Helping Hands campaign to get our readers get their lives back on their feet this weekend. So that's a great thing. And then personally, I mean, fortunately, I've been able to sort of see my parents from the garden, and it's not quite the same. But I think probably it will be a return to the pub. Simple as that.
Well, if it's any consolation, mine's on a similar line. I've missed my weekend of freedom every year when my wife Jill allows me to go to the Isle of Wight Rock Festival. All festivals were cancelled, so I've warned her as soon as we can. I'm getting the tent and I'm going camping.
Brilliant.
And I'm going to eat an overpriced burger and a few beers and dance as if no one was watching in the field. Needless to say, she says she's not coming with me. James, Alison, thank you so much for joining me today in this debate and conversation. Thank you so much, and I wish you and your teams and families the best. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having us.